Hey, welcome back. Get comfortable. Find your spot. Tonight we are going somewhere specific and familiar. A place that feels like late-night television and the soft glow of a screen in a quiet room. And something reheated in the microwave because the hour is late and the rest of the house has gone still. Tonight we are going to Quahog, Rhode Island. And we are going to take a very long, very unhurried walk through one of the most consistently under-examined threads in all of Family Guy's history. Not the cutaway gags, not the declining ratings or the character arcs. We're going to talk about addiction, about the show's long, complicated, often funny, and sometimes genuinely devastating relationship with the idea of substances and compulsions, and the things that people reach for when the ordinary world is not quite enough to make the day feel livable. This is a slow one, a story one, something to fall asleep to or stay awake through, whichever way your night is going right now. Section 1. The Neon Clam and What It Means. Peter Griffin, the Drunken Clam, and the Architecture of Addiction in Quahog. There is a bar in Quahog, Rhode Island. It sits on a corner of an unnamed street in that animated New England town, and it has been there since the very beginning of the show's existence, since the first season aired in January of 1999. It is not a particularly impressive bar when you describe its physical features in isolation. The interior is dark wood and old bar stools and a television mounted in a position that can be seen from almost every seat in the place. There is a pool table in the back. There is Horace behind the bar in the early years, and later Jerome, depending on which era of the show you are in. The drinks are not fancy. The food, when food appears at all, is the kind of food that exists because bar patrons sometimes need something to slow the absorption of what they are drinking. And there are the same men on the same stools most nights, drinking the same beer. Year after year, season after season, the same stools, the same men, the same beer. The bar is called the Drunken Clam. There is a neon sign outside shaped like a clam. The clam is drunk. Its eyes are two crossed X marks, the universal cartoon shorthand for a state of thorough intoxication. It holds a bottle. It sways slightly in the eternal animation loop, that gentle rhythm that all neon signs seem to have, as if the light itself is breathing in and out. The clam is not embarrassed by its inebriation. It is not attempting to hide it or manage it or frame it as something other than what it is. It is simply and without reservation and apparently permanently and with considerable neon-lit pride, drunk. And it announces this fact to anyone on the street who cares to look up at it. Here is a place, the sign says, a place organized around a specific state of being. Welcome. That sign was not designed carelessly. Nothing in the visual vocabulary of animation is ever purely incidental at the level of how a location is introduced. Every time the show cuts to an establishing shot of the Drunken Clam, every single time across hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, that neon sign is part of the frame. The camera finds it. The message is repeated. This is a place defined by intoxication, the name tells you. The sign confirms it. The identity of the bar is inseparable from the state it promotes and enables and celebrates with warm fluorescent light. Peter Griffin has been going to the Drunken Clam since at least 1977, a fact that the show mentioned in passing during a reference to his personal history with the place. That would have made Peter somewhere between a young teenager and a very young adult the first time he sat down on one of those bar stools, depending on which version of his age you accept from the show's famously inconsistent continuity. He was young. He found the bar, and he never really left. Across all the years of the show, across every crisis and disaster and learning moment and reset, the Drunken Clam was the one constant. The one place that was always there, always open, always the same. This is important to understand about Peter before you can understand anything else about his relationship with alcohol, which is the show's central and most sustained addiction narrative. The bar is not where Peter goes to drink. The bar is where Peter lives. In the emotional sense, in the social sense, in the sense of where he feels most himself and most at home in his own skin. The house on Spooner Street is where Peter sleeps and eats and endures the daily requirements of family life, the children and the bills, and Lois's patience wearing thin, and all the ordinary demands that constitute being Peter Griffin in the world. The Drunken Clam is where Peter actually exists as a person. It is where his identity is held and reflected back to him without judgment or expectation. Where the version of himself that he prefers is welcomed and reinforced, and not asked to be anything more or less than it already is. This is not unusual. Bars perform this function for a very large number of people in the real world, and they have been doing so for a very long time. There is a reason that the greatest situation comedy in American television history was set in a bar, and that bar's defining tagline was about a place where everybody knows your name. That tagline was not primarily about the beer. It was about being known, being expected, being the version of yourself that walks in through a specific door and is recognized without having to explain anything as the person who belongs here. The beer was just the medium through which all of that recognition and belonging was organized and transmitted. Take away the beer and the physical space remains, but the ritual that made the space meaningful dissolves. Peter Griffin, Glenn Quagmire, Joe Swanson, and Cleveland Brown sit at the same table at the Drunken Clam with a regularity that is depicted across the show's entire run as one of the most stable and important elements of their respective lives. Their friendship is real. It is warm in its way, and in the specific way that certain male friendships are warm, which is to say that the warmth is present but not often articulated directly. These are men who show up for each other in the particular masculine mode of the era the show is drawing on, which is to say they do not talk about their feelings with any directness or comfort, but they are present, and their presence means something. They appear. They sit together. They order the same thing. And the act of being there reliably, consistently, night after night, is itself a form of love or something close enough to it that the distinction may not matter. And the presence is organized almost entirely around the shared consumption of Pawtucket Patriot Ale. Pawtucket Patriot is the fictional beer brand that the show created as the universe's primary lager, named for the fictional Pawtucket Patriot sports franchise that provides the backdrop for various episodes throughout the show's run. Peter eventually works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery itself, which is an extraordinary fact if you let yourself dwell on it for a moment. His professional employment and his social life and his deepest sense of personal identity are all organized in concentric circles around this single substance. He makes it for money. He drinks it for pleasure. He drinks it with the men he loves most in the world. He drinks it at home in the evenings while watching television. He drinks it in the morning, which Lois notices with the resigned patience of someone who has long since stopped believing that calling attention to it will change anything, because it will not, and she knows it will not, and she has made a kind of peace with knowing it. What is interesting about this, and what the show handled with varying degrees of conscious self-awareness across its very long run, is that Peter's drinking is almost never framed as a problem in itself. It is framed as a fact, a condition of being. Part of the landscape of his life, the way his weight is part of that landscape, or his job, or the particular house he lives in, or any of the other stable features of a world that the show's format requires to remain stable. These are the conditions of being Peter Griffin, and they do not require commentary because they have always been exactly this way, and the show's format does not accommodate genuine and lasting personal change. But the early seasons, when the show was still most careful and most thoughtful about the humanity of its characters, did something quietly remarkable with Peter's drinking that gets overlooked in most discussions of the show. They gave it texture, real texture. When Peter sat at the bar with his friends in those early episodes, you could feel the specific comfort of that scene. Not just because the characters were funny, but because the dynamics were true in a way that extended beyond comedy. The bar conversation was never about anything too serious. It was never pressured by the requirements of the outside world. It was never organized around someone else's agenda or someone else's needs. The Drunken Clam was a space that existed outside of obligation. And for Peter, who was overworked and underappreciated and surrounded by a family whose needs were constant and whose gratitude was, at best, inconsistent, that space was not optional. It was oxygen. It was the breathing room that made everything else possible. This is not a defense of heavy drinking. I want to be clear about that. It is a description of why heavy drinking persists in the lives of certain kinds of people, in certain kinds of communities, across long periods of time, despite the evidence accumulating around them that the drinking is doing damage. The relief is real. The social warmth is real. The temporary release from the weight of a life that feels, most of the time, like slightly more than you were built to carry, is real. Family Guy in its first 3 seasons understood this because the people making the show understood the lives they were drawing. They had seen these men. They had sat at bars with these men, or been these men in certain configurations of their own lives. They drew from life, and life was specific, and the specificity was what made those early scenes land. Brian Griffin's relationship with alcohol ran entirely parallel to Peter's, but was composed in a completely different register. Brian drank martinis in the early seasons. Gin martinis, shoddy with an olive in a proper glass. The choice of drink was characterful and intentional in a way that the show was clearly aware of. Peter drank beer from cans at a bar counter. Brian drank chilled, precise cocktails from proper glassware at home or sitting in the family living room, the kind of drink that requires a certain amount of equipment to prepare correctly and a certain amount of intention to choose. The distinction was meaningful. Brian's drinking was performed as sophistication, as the outward expression of a self-image that required constant maintenance, as evidence that he was a different category of person from the others in the household. He was cultured, he was discerning, he was not simply consuming, he was appreciating something. This is one of the more accurate observations the show made, at least in its better moments, about a specific kind of drinker. The person who has organized their substance use into an aesthetic framework, who frames the drinking not as drinking, but as connoisseurship, whose relationship to the bottle is, in their own self-understanding, really a relationship to refinement and knowledge and the pleasures of the developed palate. The martini instead of the beer tells a story about who you are, and Brian needed that story in a way that was deep and persistent. He needed to be the smart one, the thoughtful one, the one whose relationship to intoxication was somehow elevated by the manner of its pursuit. The form of the drink was doing the same work as the content of his bookshelves, and his literary opinions and his Prius. It was telling him and anyone watching that he was a certain kind of person. By the time you reach season 5 of the show, the series began to acknowledge more directly that Brian was drinking in ways that went beyond any aesthetic justification he could sustain. TV Tropes notes explicitly in the Brian Griffin character page that he drinks occasionally at the start of the series and has become a full-blown alcoholic by season 5. The show registered this shift not through dramatic intervention or formal acknowledgement, but through the gradual and almost casual escalation of how often Brian's drinking appeared as a background detail in any given scene. He was refilling the glass more often. He was depicted getting very drunk more frequently. The jokes about his drinking became less about the sophistication of his choices and more about the quantity and the outcomes. Quagmire's famous speech in season 8 would eventually and directly call Brian out as a big, sad, alcoholic bore, and the show's history up to that point did not contradict this description. It confirmed it, brick by brick, across many seasons of Brian making decisions that the alcohol had either enabled or directly caused. And the fact that the show acknowledged this through Quagmire, a character with his own very significant moral failings, rather than through any formal narrative intervention or consequence, said something about how the show understood the situation. It was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be noted, occasionally, by other characters, while life in Quahog continued exactly as it always had. The Drunken Clam as a physical location and emotional anchor underwent changes across the show's long run that deserve attention. When Horace, the original barman, died and Jerome took over the bar, the show gave that transition genuine emotional time and weight. Peter and his friends mourned Horace's passing in a way that felt earned and real rather than perfunctory, because Horace was not simply a background character who had served a functional purpose. He was the keeper of a space that mattered deeply and specifically to the people who used it most. A barman you have known for decades is something close to a confessor in the original sense of the word. Someone who has heard the jokes and the complaints and the plans that were abandoned, and the disasters that were not avoided, and the small daily grievances of a life that nobody else wants to hear about. Someone who has heard all of this and never once judged, never once repeated what was said to the wrong person, never once made you feel that the thing you came in needing was too much to ask for. Horace was exactly that for Peter and his friends. Jerome became that, more gradually and less completely. But the new version of the space was still the space. The ritual was maintained, and the ritual is ultimately the point of all of this. What the Drunken Clam provided, night after night, across the entire run of the show and presumably for the rest of the characters' fictional lives, was a stable practice organized around a substance that made the practice feel comfortable and natural and right. The ritual was so deeply embedded in the life of the show that removing it would have been impossible without fundamentally altering what Family Guy was, what it felt like, what it was about. This is also a true thing about how addiction operates within communities and within families across real time. The bar is not simply a bar. The ritual is not simply a ritual. These things accumulate meaning across years and decades, until removing them does not just mean removing the substance, but means dismantling an entire architecture of social being. You are not just asking someone to drink less. You are asking them to become someone different, someone who relates to the world and to the people in it through different structures and different rituals. And that is a very large ask. Before we go any further into all of this, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Late nights and early mornings both count. It matters to me that you are here, wherever you are. And if this is the kind of slow, careful, story-driven content that you want more of, please subscribe to the channel. It keeps this going, and it means genuinely more to me than I can properly express in a brief ask like this one. Section 2. Wasted Talent. A silver scroll, a piano, and the particular comedy of the functional drunk. The second season of Family Guy aired across 1999 and 2000, and within that season lived an episode that many viewers across all the years and all the seasons since have returned to as one of the show's very finest. It was called Wasted Talent, and it first aired on July 26th of the year 2000. It was written and produced during the period when the show was operating at the absolute height of its early creative energy, when every joke felt intentional and purposeful, when every story was built with the kind of structural care and genuine human observation that the show's later seasons would slowly, and then more rapidly, learn to do without. The premise was simple enough on its surface, built on a parody that almost every member of the audience would recognize immediately and bring their own memories to. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the fictional beer company whose product Peter Griffin consumed in quantities that would alarm any physician who examined him, had organized a special promotional contest. Hidden inside certain selected cans and bottles of Pawtucket Patriot Ale were silver scrolls. Find a scroll and you won a private tour of the brewery itself. The episode was an explicit, loving, and extremely well-executed parody of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the 1971 film based on Roald Dahl's novel, which had by 2000 already lodged itself so permanently in the cultural memory of at least 2 generations that almost anyone over the age of 15 would know the structure being referenced the moment it appeared. The golden ticket becomes a silver scroll. The chocolate factory becomes a beer factory. The children become a middle-aged man and his talking dog. The parody worked because the films being compared were structurally so similar. The contest that requires consuming the product to find the prize. The tour of the magical production facility. The proprietor who is theatrical and slightly menacing about the rules. The room you are explicitly told not to enter. The inevitable entering of that room. All of these elements mapped onto the beer factory setting with the kind of precision that suggests real affection for the source material, which indeed the show's writers were known to have. But the episode's real power, the thing that makes it more interesting than a well-executed parody, was what the parody revealed about Peter Griffin and his relationship to the thing being produced in that brewery. In order to find the silver scroll, Peter drank an enormous quantity of Pawtucket Patriot Ale across many consecutive days, turning the contest into a sustained, dedicated, almost professional drinking project. He was not alone in this. His friends at the Drunken Clam participated. They sat at the bar night after night, cracking open cans, examining the labels, consuming beer in quantities that the episode played entirely for comedy, but that any observer existing outside the show's reality would recognize as well beyond what any physician would call reasonable. The drinking was not primarily pleasure during this period, or not only pleasure. It was purposeful. It had a goal attached to it. It was organized around an external aim, and the external aim made it acceptable in a way that it might not have been otherwise. This particular structure, the project that gives you permission to drink more than you normally would, while framing the consumption as dedication rather than habit, is something that a very large portion of any audience watching this episode would recognize from their own experience, without necessarily having the vocabulary to name what they were recognizing. The sporting event that justifies the quantity. The reunion that frames the binge as celebration. The difficult week that earns the bottle opened on Friday and drained by Saturday afternoon. The external circumstance that insulates the internal behavior from scrutiny. When drinking has a reason attached to it, the question of whether the drinking itself is the reason simply does not arise. You are not a heavy drinker. You are someone who is participating in a contest. The distinction feels real from the inside, even when it is not entirely real from the outside. Peter eventually found the scroll. He and Brian won the tour. They walked through Pawtucket Pat's brewery in a sequence that replicated the Wonka factory tour almost note for note, with the same slow construction of wonder, the same rooms of escalating strangeness, the same theatrical proprietor who moved through his own creation, with the particular pride of someone who has built something extraordinary and wants you to feel its magic the way he does. The brewery was remarkable, and at its center was a forbidden room, a room Pat told them explicitly and with great seriousness never to enter, containing an experimental formula, a beer that had never been released to the public because the formulation process was not yet complete. Peter and Brian drank it. Of course they drank it. The entire episode had been building this moment. The rule was there to be broken. The warning existed to be ignored. The experimental substance was placed in the narrative precisely so it could be consumed by the people who were most clearly told not to consume it. This is the Wonka structure. The temptation must be present and must be failed. They drank it. They were ejected from the brewery. Drunk and humiliated on the walk home, Peter stumbled into the Griffin house and in a moment of displaced emotion, some combination of anger and self-pity and the specific emotional vulnerability that a certain blood alcohol level produces by dissolving the barriers between a person and their own feelings. He sat down at the family piano and played it. Not just adequately, not just tolerably, with a skill and a fluency and an expressiveness that were completely and genuinely extraordinary. The music that came out of Peter Griffin at that particular moment was far beyond anything that any member of the household or anyone who knew Peter in any capacity had ever imagined he was capable of producing. Lois heard it from the other room. She heard it and she stood in the doorway and her face changed in a way that was visible even in the show's animation style. Something she had not been expecting was happening, and the unexpectedness of it was changing something in her plans. Lois had been struggling throughout the episode with a separate problem. She taught piano lessons, and she had been trying to find a student talented enough to win an upcoming competition with her rival Alexis Radcliffe, who had a prodigy of her own. Lois's previous promising student had dropped out under the pressure of her coaching. The competition deadline was approaching. She had nothing. She had been walking toward a humiliation she could not prevent. And then Peter sat down at the piano. The catch, established quickly and confirmed with repeated testing, was that Peter could only play the piano when he was drunk. Not slightly tipsy, not casually loosened up. Within a specific and fairly narrow blood alcohol range, the talent was there, complete and reliable and genuinely remarkable. Below that range, he fumbled the keys like anyone with no musical training. Above it, he was too intoxicated to coordinate the movements required. But right in the window, the gift was present, consistent, extraordinary, and entirely dependent on the presence of alcohol in his bloodstream at a precise and specific concentration. What followed after Lois understood this was the transformation of her role in relation to Peter's drinking. Throughout the show's history, Lois had been positioned as the corrective force on Peter's alcohol consumption. She expressed frustration and concern. She sometimes issued ultimatums. She represented in the show's moral economy, the voice of moderation and consequence and what used to be called propriety. And then she discovered that Peter's drinking produced music, and her relationship to his drinking changed completely and immediately without apparent conflict or any visible moral deliberation. She became the manager and enabler of his consumption. She was not trying to moderate him now, she was trying to maintain him, to keep him calibrated within the operational zone where the talent was accessible and reproducible. She timed his drinks, she measured quantities, she administered beer on a schedule organized entirely around her competitive ambitions for the piano competition, with no meaningful consideration of what keeping Peter drunk for multiple days running might mean for anything else in his life, or in her life, or in the life of the family who shared the house with both of them. The comedy of this was excellent and recognized as excellent by audiences at the time. The image of Lois, who was usually the household's instrument of moderation, carefully calibrating her husband's blood alcohol level like a racing car engineer monitoring fuel, was a sharp and specific subversion of her usual role that landed cleanly. But the logic underneath the comedy was more uncomfortable if you allowed yourself to look at it directly and without the protective layer of the joke. What the episode showed, almost certainly without the writers having consciously planned this particular reading, was how quickly the people who are supposed to want the best for you can find a reason to actively facilitate your worst habits the moment those habits happen to serve their own interests and goals. Lois did not experience any visible moral difficulty about keeping Peter drunk for several consecutive days in order to win a piano competition against a woman she resented. The potential consequences of maintaining him at that level for that duration, the consequences to his health, to their relationship, to his ability to function in whatever other capacities his life required of him. To the children who lived in the same house and were presumably observing all of this, none of this entered the narrative in any sustained way. The goal was the competition. The means was the beer. The end was supposed to justify both. This is an extremely common human arrangement, and the fact that it appeared in a cartoon does not make it less recognizable as such. The competition arrived. Peter was thoroughly intoxicated when Lois positioned him at the piano and pointed him at the keys. The talent was operational. He played. The crowd was struck silent in the specific way that comedy audiences are struck silent, with that exaggerated cartoon stillness that precedes the release of collective reaction. And then, while he was still playing, the alcohol began to wear off in real time. Not dramatically, gradually, the way things wear off when the supply is not replenished. And the talent drained with the alcohol, finger by finger, bar by bar, the music dissolving from something extraordinary into something fumbling, and then something genuinely bad, the crowd's frozen admiration converting to confused embarrassment as the performance fell apart in front of them. Lois had kept him too drunk for too long and had lost track of the precise calibration that the talent required. The window had closed. The gift was gone. They did not win the competition. What the episode was quietly describing, beneath all the comedy and the Wonka imagery and the very funny jokes, was a specific and recognizable thing. The gift that exists only inside the substance. The idea that there is something beautiful inside a person, genuinely and verifiably beautiful, that their ordinary, sober, daily self cannot access without chemical assistance. This is a real phenomenon and not a funny one when you look at it, without the comedy softening it. The writer who cannot find the sentences without the drink open. The performer who only feels free on stage when intoxicated enough that the anxiety has been dissolved. The painter whose work is only alive when the work and the drinking happen simultaneously. These are real people with the real gifts that their own fear or self-consciousness or the accumulated weight of their ordinary selves keeps behind a barrier most of the time. The substance provides the key, and the problem with that arrangement, the thing the episode's title was pointing toward, is that the key and the lock are both slowly, persistently, inexorably destroying the room they were designed to open. A talent accessed only through intoxication will never grow through sober practice. It will never be available on demand in the conditions the person needs it. It will never be reliably there when the competition actually starts. It is always on loan from the substance, and the substance does not give loans without interest. And the interest compounds in ways that the person cannot track until the debt is very large indeed. The wasted talent of the title was working on multiple levels and knew it was working on them. The talent was wasted in the competition because the alcohol wore off at the worst possible moment. But the talent was also wasted in the larger and more permanent sense. The sense that a gift permanently hitched to a dependency will always be hostage to that dependency, will always be managed by it and compromised by it and eventually consumed by it. Family Guy played all of this for laughs because it was and is a comedy, and the episode was excellent comedy. But the truth lived quietly in the architecture of the story, available to anyone patient enough to find it. Section 3, The Thin White Line. Brian, Cocaine, and the Anatomy of a Relatable Spiral. Season 3 of Family Guy is what most people mean when they use the phrase, the show's golden era. The writing was at its most precise and most ambitious. The characters had the clarity and warmth that would slowly be eroded by time and changing writers, and the particular entropy of long-running television. Seth MacFarlane was most directly and personally involved in the creative output. And the season premiered in July of 2001 with what remains, across the entire run of the show, the most sustained and the most accurate piece of storytelling about addiction that Family Guy ever produced. The episode was called The Thin White Line. It was written by Steve Callahan and directed by Glenn Hill. It aired on July 11th, 2001. It was also, notably, the first episode broadcast after the show's first cancellation and subsequent revival on Adult Swim, a fact that gave it a particular energy and intentionality. The writers were back. They had survived an interruption they had not expected to survive. They had things they wanted to say, and they were going to say them. What they chose to say was about emptiness, about the particular, persistent, difficult-to-name kind of suffering that comes from having everything you need and still feeling profoundly and fundamentally lacking in something you cannot identify or locate or address through any of the ordinary available means. Brian Griffin opened the episode in a therapist's office. This was itself a notable narrative choice because the show could have started anywhere, as it almost always started in the middle of something loud and external. But this episode began in a quiet room, with Brian seated across from a professional, speaking about his interior life in terms that suggested he had been trying to find these words for some time. Brian told his therapist that he was in a rut, not in crisis, not at rock bottom, not visibly falling apart in any way that anyone could point to and name. He was simply stuck. He was passing through his days and performing the functions that his days required, and none of it was connecting to anything that felt necessary or meaningful or genuinely his in any deep sense. This is a specific and recognizable kind of suffering that most popular entertainment handles very poorly. It is not acute. It does not have a clean cause or a clean solution. It is the chronic, low-level dissatisfaction of someone whose life is objectively adequate and who still cannot locate the feeling of it being adequate. It is the suffering that people in certain comfortable arrangements of life are sometimes told they have no right to feel, which makes it worse rather than better. The therapist's prescription for Brian was gentle and practical. Stop being so inwardly focused. Do something for others. Try something that takes you outside the comfortable and limited loop of the same days in the same house around the same people who have long since stopped surprising you. Brian took this seriously. He tried volunteering. He tried guide dog work for visually impaired people, which did not suit him because his attention kept wandering toward whatever happened to catch his interest. He tried other kinds of service that felt similarly insufficient. None of it produced the specific sense of purpose he was seeking. And then Joe Swanson, in a moment of genuine helpfulness, offered him something unexpected. The Quahog Police Department needed drug-sniffing dogs, and Brian's canine olfactory capabilities, which the show had almost never invoked in any meaningful way because Brian was functionally written as a human who technically happened to be a dog, would make him extraordinarily effective at the work. The transformation was rapid and real within the show's register. Brian was outstanding. He could locate cocaine in airport luggage that the human officers walked past without noting. He identified hidden stashes in vehicles that other approaches had missed entirely. He was recognized and celebrated as exceptional at something that genuinely mattered to the people who needed it done. For the first time in a long time, possibly the first time in the life of the show itself, Brian had a purpose that was specifically suited to his specific nature. He was not succeeding because he was articulate or well-read, or because he had strong opinions about literature and politics. He was succeeding because of what he was, essentially and fundamentally, in a way that could not be borrowed or performed or substituted with a better self-presentation. And this mattered to him in a way that the episode depicted quietly and without sentimentality. The problem arrived the way the most serious problems of this kind arrive in real life. Gradually, almost imperceptibly. During an airport drug bust, a suitcase containing a significant quantity of cocaine was split open in the search process, and Brian, whose entire professional value depended on being in close proximity to this particular substance, inhaled some of it. The cocaine entered his bloodstream. And then something changed. The show did not cut to a dramatic reaction. It cut away and then cut back to Brian slightly later, doing his job, and the only visible sign of what had happened was a subtle shift in his energy level. He was a little sharper, a little faster. The work that had already been meaningful was now also pleasurable in a specific, elevated way. The things that had required effort were suddenly easy. The things that had been easy were now effortless. This is the actual experience of a first encounter with a stimulant for many people, and the show understood this rather than reaching for the more dramatic, cinematic version of the moment. Not destruction, not a clear before and after, a subtle improvement. An escalation of capacity that felt like finally being the person you always suspected you could be. Brian sought out the substance again, not in a dramatic or theatrical way, quietly, the way people return to anything that made them feel substantially better. He found situations where he might encounter it. He used it again. The arc began in earnest. His professional performance deteriorated in the specific and not quite linear way that dependency-related deterioration actually works. Some days still exceptional, other days unreliable. The unreliability increasing in frequency as the dependency deepened. His personal behavior became erratic. The intelligence that had always been his most consistent and most valued characteristic started flickering, present sometimes and elsewhere at other times. When Brian came home visibly intoxicated on cocaine, the family staged an intervention. The scene was handled with a care and a sincerity that the early show was still capable of bringing to things that mattered. Stewie attempted a joke and was told by the others to stop. The family was serious. This was not a comedy beat. Brian was in real trouble, and the people around him knew it, and they were doing the thing that people who love someone are supposed to do when they recognize it. Brian agreed to enter rehab. The rehab facility was depicted as a real and functioning place. Not a parody. Not a set dressed to make recovery look ridiculous or futile. It had structure. It had therapy. It had the specific texture of a place where serious and necessary personal work was being attempted by people who needed to do it. Brian's commitment to the process was genuine if uncertain. The commitment of someone who knows they are in the right place and is not sure the right place is going to be enough. And then Peter arrived. Peter, having been denied the family vacation because of Brian's situation, had decided to fake his own addiction in order to access the rehab facility's comfortable amenities. The ethical dimensions of this did not occur to Peter because the ethical dimensions of most things did not occur to Peter unless someone else pointed them out directly and repeatedly. He moved in. He made demands. He was enormously, cheerfully, unself-consciously himself, in a context that required people to be something other than Peter Griffin. The comedy of Peter in the rehab facility was very good, but the episode was also doing something harder underneath it. It was depicting, in exaggerated form, the experience of trying to do genuine personal work in an environment where someone who refuses to take the work seriously is present and consuming everyone's attention. This is not an uncommon experience. The person trying to address a real problem in a household that has decided the problem is not real. The person trying to recover in a social environment where the substance use is normalized and invited. Peter was an extreme and comic version of this dynamic, but the dynamic itself was drawn from something real. The therapist eventually told Brian that in his professional assessment, Peter was the underlying cause of Brian's cocaine dependency. The accumulated stress of living with Peter, navigating Peter, being constantly recruited into Peter's disasters, was the source of the pressure that had driven Brian to seek chemical relief. The cocaine was not the disease. The conditions of Brian's life were the disease. The cocaine was the medicine that produced a worse illness. Brian was furious. He rejected the diagnosis. He walked out of rehab. He did not walk out because he was healed. He walked out because the explanation being offered to him felt like an excuse he could not accept and live with. To take the therapist's reading seriously would be to make himself a victim of external circumstances, to locate the source of his choices outside of himself, to say in some structural way that this was not really his fault. And Brian could not do this, not because the explanation was wrong, but because accepting it would take away something he needed more urgently than he needed the therapy. He needed to believe that he was the author of his own choices, that the future was genuinely available to him as territory he could act in, that he could decide things, including different things, that the person who had made those choices could make other choices. That possibility was incompatible with the therapist's framing. He left. He told the family something about destiny and the self. He hailed a cab. The Griffins watched him drive away into the conclusion of his Season 3 finale. Not saved, not destroyed. Simply in motion, heading somewhere unknown, because the place he had been was not working. That is not a clean resolution. It is not the lesson delivered and received and understood that a conventional, very special episode would provide. It is something closer to the way things actually go, when they go honestly. Section 4. Breaking out is hard to do. Lois Griffin and the shoplifting arc that was really about something else. There is a version of Lois Griffin that most people who watch the early seasons of the show remember with genuine affection. She was reasonable. She was patient. She was the structurally necessary counterweight to Peter's enormous and perpetually colliding force of personality. She kept the house operational. She absorbed the chaos that Peter generated and converted it into something the children and the community and the calendar could survive. She was not a saint. The show was clear-eyed enough to avoid that particular flatness, but she was functional and grounded in a way that the other principal characters were not. She was the person you could imagine existing in the world outside the animation, doing recognizable things for recognizable reasons. The episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do, which aired on July 17th of 2005 as part of the show's 4th season. The first season after the cancellation and the revival introduced a Lois story that used the particular narrative structure of addiction with more care and more intelligence than most of the show's drug and alcohol plots managed. It was written by John Wiener and directed by Brian Hogan. It aired at a moment when the show was still carrying most of what had made its original 3 seasons work, still telling stories rather than simply delivering joke delivery vehicles loosely connected by something that resembled a plot. The episode begins with a domestic situation that required no special setup to be understood immediately by any adult watching it. Lois was grocery shopping. She was managing the specific and mostly invisible labor of maintaining a household, the kind of work that is never finished because it is never allowed to be finished, the kind of work that is recognized as having been done only when it stops being done and things fall apart visibly. She was selecting a ham. The ham was expensive. She was already in the specific mental state of someone accounting, adjusting, substituting, managing the gap between what she wanted and what she could reasonably spend. She picked up the ham and put it in her bag. She paid for everything else. She walked out of the store with the ham still in the bag. She had not planned this. The show was careful to establish that there was no premeditation here. No scheme, no calculation. It was an impulsive act that surprised her as much as it surprised anyone who saw it. When she got home and realized what she had done, she was alarmed at herself. The ham sat in her kitchen with the specific weight of something that had arrived there through means she had not consciously chosen, but she ate it, and it tasted fine, and then she went back. The show understood and depicted with real precision that what Lois was experiencing after the initial theft was not hunger for food or desire for objects. It was the specific and difficult-to-describe charge of having acted outside the ordinary constraints of her life and gotten away with it. She was the person who managed the house, who kept the budget, who told Peter what they could and could not afford, who maintained the public and private face of a family that was always somewhat expensive to maintain. She was responsible. She was known as responsible. Being known as responsible is its own kind of cage, not because responsibility is bad, but because the performance of it, the constant and visible and never acknowledged performance of it, accumulates a pressure that finds no ordinary release. The shoplifting was the release. The risk, the transgression, the fact of having taken something and walked out with it and not been caught, produced a physiological and psychological response that nothing in Lois's ordinary life was producing anymore. The show did not use clinical language for this, and it did not need to. It depicted the thing itself. Lois returning to the store, then to other stores. The escalation of what she took, moving from food items to clothes to electronics, not because she needed these things, but because the need for the feeling required increasing stimulus to produce the same result. The classic and terrible arc. The dose that worked yesterday is not the dose that works today. The dose that works today will not be adequate tomorrow. The floor is always falling. She was caught. Of course she was caught. The episode was not going to produce a Lois who shoplifted forever and was never caught, because that would be a different show with a different premise. She was arrested. She was taken to jail, and then the episode did the thing that made it stranger and more interesting than its premise suggested it might be. Peter, with the assistance of the family and their associates, physically broke Lois out of jail. They drove to Canada. They hid in a district of the city called Asiantown. They built a new life briefly under assumed identities, while Lois processed what she had done and why and what it meant. The Canada sequence was played for comedy and produced good comedy, but it also served the episode's quieter argument, which was about what actually happened when someone whose life was organized around managing and providing suddenly stopped managing and providing. The family did not disintegrate instantly. They managed. They were uncomfortable, and the management was messier than Lois's version. But they managed. And Lois watched this and felt something that the episode did not name directly, but made visible in her face and her posture. She was not irreplaceable. The machine did not stop when she stepped out of it. The machine kept going, more chaotically and with worse outcomes, but going nonetheless. This is a thing that people who organize their entire identity around being the competent one sometimes discover at exactly the wrong moment. You have been doing all of this because it needed doing, yes, but also because you needed to be doing it. Because the doing of it was the architecture of your selfhood. Because without it, the question of who you are and what you want and what you feel sits exposed in a way that the doing was always protecting you from having to face. Lois's shoplifting was not really about the objects. It was about finding a way to feel something outside the architecture, something that belonged to her specifically and not to the management project, something secret and transgressive and genuinely hers. The resolution was that Lois turned herself in, accepted a sentence of community service, and the family returned to Quahog. The structure reestablished itself. The roles returned to their correct positions. Lois was again the competent one. The episode acknowledged that this was maybe not entirely a resolution by giving it only a few lines of dialogue, the kind of quick narrative closure that the show applied when it was not entirely sure it had answered the question it had asked, which it had not entirely answered because the question of what Lois was actually seeking when she put her hand in her bag was not one that a sentence of community service was going to address. It would be answered by either a change in the conditions of her life, or it would not be answered, and the same pressure would build again until a different release presented itself. The show never returned to this territory with Lois in any sustained way. The next seasons would do many things with Lois, not all of them kind or consistent, or in keeping with the person this episode had taken the trouble to build. But for 22 minutes of July 2005, the show gave Lois Griffin a specific and human and recognizable kind of trouble, and it treated that trouble with the seriousness it deserved. The fact that a stolen ham started the whole thing made it funnier than it would have been. But the thing it was describing was not funny at all, and the episode, in its best moments, knew the difference. Section 5. Friends of Peter G. Death, Moderation, and the Lesson That Was Unlearned. Season 9 of Family Guy aired across 2010 and 2011, and it was a season in which the show was navigating something difficult. The characters had changed enough from their original selves that certain kinds of storytelling were becoming harder to do without the show acknowledging the changes and their implications. Peter had drifted further from lovable toward cruel. Brian had become something that was more performance than person. Stewie was deep into his transition away from villainy and toward emotional availability, but the writing was still capable in individual episodes of producing something that felt genuinely earned and true. Friends of Peter G., which first aired on February 13th of 2011, was the strongest evidence of this capacity in that season. The setup was brisk and had the specific velocity of a Season 9 episode. Peter and Brian, who by this point had each given the show many separate opportunities to examine their relationship to alcohol, were arrested together for drunk driving. The judge sentenced both of them to attend Alcoholics Anonymous. The comedy of Peter in an AA meeting room, earnest and completely unable to perceive or respect the emotional register the space required, was very good. Peter treated the vulnerability of the other participants as material for entertainment. He told stories, he made jokes. He refrained from listening in any deep sense because listening required a quality of sustained outward attention that Peter could not maintain when he himself was in the room and available as a more interesting subject. But the episode's real engine was not the AA meeting. It was what happened to Peter when Death appeared to him, not as threat, as guide. Death, played by Norm Macdonald in what remains one of the voice cast's most quietly perfect performances across the show's entire run, showed Peter two versions of his future. Not in the melodramatic Ghost of Christmas future way that this narrative device usually deploys, with the darkness and the billowing robes and the horror. Death was matter-of-fact about it. Practical, a civil servant of the universe with a job to do and a time constraint to work within. He showed Peter the life of a man who kept drinking the way he was drinking. The marriage worn down to tactical management rather than affection. The children navigating around him rather than toward him, the way children do when the adult in the household has become a hazard to be routed around. The physical deterioration, which was depicted without dramatic music or exaggerated horror, just the way a human body looks when it has been used this way for long enough. The social architecture of his life Kanarate diet. Because a person who cannot be reliably present, who can be any version of himself depending on where he is in the arc of a given evening's drinking, has to maintain fewer relationships because genuine relationship requires a version of yourself that is available consistently. Then Death showed him the other life. The life of moderation. Not sobriety as a complete and permanent state, the show was clear about this. The choice being presented was not between drinking and not drinking, but between excess and restraint. This was a morally interesting choice to put at the center of an episode about alcohol. The show was not arguing that alcohol itself was the problem. It was arguing about volume and consequence and the distinction between use and misuse. Peter, watching the moderate version of himself, saw a man whose marriage was warmer because he was more reliably present in it, whose children approached him rather than navigated around him, whose body had not been pushed to the point where the pushing was visible in the posture and the color and the face, whose friendships were sustained by mutual engagement rather than by the mutual tolerance of people who have been around the table long enough to accept each other's worst habits as simply the price of the table. Peter was moved. The episode gave him a moment of genuine emotional response that was not played primarily for comedy, which in Season 9 was rarer than it should have been. He understood something, not everything, not in the deep and thorough and permanent way that would require more episodes and more time than one 22-minute story could contain. But something. He chose moderation. In a visual image that was simple and specific enough to be genuinely resonant, he poured half of his beer down the sink. Not the whole beer, half. The thing he had been drinking was not the problem. Drinking all of it, all the time, without restraint or reflection was the problem. This was an unusually adult and nuanced position for the show to take. It was not making an argument for abstinence, it was making an argument for consciousness, for the difference between the relationship to a substance where you are the one making choices about it and the relationship where the substance is the one making choices about you. Peter, keeping half the beer, was saying something precise. This thing is mine to manage, and I can manage it, and I choose to manage it now. That is a small and significant kind of agency, and the episode presented it clearly and without irony. Brian's parallel arc through the episode was equally honest, though in a different register. Brian sat in the AA meeting and listened in the way that Brian, at his best, actually could listen, with the intelligence and the attention that made him the show's most reliable recipient of the truth when the show wanted to say something true. And what Brian heard, underneath the specific testimonies and the specific people and the specific rooms, was the organizing structure of all of it. A group of people who had recognized that their relationship to a substance had passed the point of being theirs to manage. Who had accepted that the management project had failed and that something else was required. Who were building a different architecture for their daily experience, one day at a time in the most literal sense, because longer-term projections were not the right scale for this particular work. Brian did not admit he was an alcoholic. The show did not push him to. But he sat in the room, and he was quiet in a way that suggested he had heard more than he was prepared to say. This was honest. This was Brian at his most recognizable from the original characterization, the dog who absorbed more than he demonstrated absorbing, who kept the most important observations inside while offering the smaller ones as evidence of his intelligence. The episode ended with Peter choosing moderation. It ended with the show making an explicit and clear argument that it was possible to change your relationship to something that had been harming you, that the possibility of different choices was real and available, that the future was not simply the present repeated with accelerating consequences. This was a hopeful thing to say. It was also, within the logic of the show as it actually operated, an argument that the show itself was unwilling to honor in any sustained or permanent way. Because the show reset, as it always reset, because the demands of a long-running comedy that has built its identity around a specific set of character behaviors are fundamentally incompatible with the kind of growth that would require those behaviors to change. Peter came back in subsequent episodes drinking exactly as he always had, in the same quantities and with the same absence of reflection. And Friends of Peter G was quietly placed on the same shelf as every other episode where Peter learned something and then stopped knowing it by the following week. Season 23 produced an episode that was widely received as the final insult to the argument Friends of Peter G had tried to make. An episode aired that functionally undid the earlier installment's conclusions, depicting Peter's relationship with alcohol in terms that were so far from anything resembling the man who poured half his beer down the drain that the earlier episode might as well have aired on a different show about different people. The moderation lesson was not remembered. The moment with death was not referenced. The choice Peter had made was not treated as a choice he had made. He was simply himself again, the version of himself who existed before the lesson, and the arc of Friends of Peter G was rendered meaningless in the most casual and efficient way possible, by being forgotten entirely. This is not a cynical observation about the show specifically. It is a true observation about how the show operated, and about why that operation, across enough seasons, made certain kinds of storytelling impossible. If no choice sticks and no growth is retained, and no lesson is remembered past the episode that contained it, then the show can only be about the repetition of the same dynamics indefinitely, which is what it became, and the repetition eventually is what drove most of the audience away. Section 6, Seahorse Seashell Party. Mushrooms, a hurricane, and the night Brian lost his ear. Season 10 of Family Guy premiered in the fall of 2011. And the second episode of that season, Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired on October 2nd, 2011, occupies a strange and specific place in the show's history. It is remembered by most viewers for the Meg storyline that ran parallel to its A-plot, the episode in which Meg finally confronted her family about how they treated her, and for a brief and remarkable stretch of television, she was given the vocabulary and the emotional standing to name her own suffering directly and without apology. That storyline has been analyzed extensively elsewhere, including in the transcript that this channel used as a style reference, and it deserves every bit of the attention it has received. But the A-plot of that episode, the story that anchored the episode's structure and that occupied Peter and Lois and Chris for the duration of the hurricane that served as the night's central event, was Brian's. Brian, stuck inside the Griffin house as a genuine storm moved through Quahog and made leaving both impossible and inadvisable, had obtained and consumed a quantity of psilocybin mushrooms. Magic mushrooms. The kind of substance that was, at the time of the episode's broadcast, classified as a Schedule 1 controlled substance under federal law and was not available through any legal market in the United States outside of a small number of carefully monitored research contexts. The decision to build an episode around Brian's mushroom experience was not an accident or a casual creative choice. Psilocybin is not alcohol. It is not cocaine. It does not produce dependency in the physiological sense that the other substances the show had examined produce dependency. It does not create withdrawal syndromes or compulsive seeking behavior in the way that stimulants and depressants and opioids do. It is not the kind of thing you build a tolerance to in any linear way. The scientific and medical literature on psilocybin, which has expanded enormously in the years since this episode aired, suggests that it is among the least addictive of all psychoactive substances, that its harms are primarily psychological rather than physical, and that its therapeutic potential for depression, anxiety, and end-of-life distress is significant and real. Including it in a series about substance use, especially a series that had built a very specific vocabulary around alcohol and cocaine and prescription medication, was a different kind of narrative gesture. Brian was not depicted as an addict in this episode. He was depicted as someone choosing to use a specific substance in a specific situation for reasons that were, at least partially, grounded in a desire for a qualitatively different experience of consciousness than his ordinary daily life provided. He had obtained the mushrooms, he had the house, he had the hurricane, he chose to consume them. Stewie became his babysitter for the duration. This was both the comedy engine of the episode and something more than that. Stewie, in his Season 10 configuration, was no longer the evil baby genius of the early years. He was the pragmatist, the one who could be relied upon to manage a situation with the specific competence that the situation required, without any of the emotional theatrics that the situation might produce in someone less controlled. He sat with Brian through the hours of the mushroom experience, and he did what a good person in that situation does. He stayed. He kept Brian physically safe. He talked to him when talking helped, and was quiet when quiet helped. He did not make it about himself. Brian, under the influence of the mushrooms, experienced a progression that the show depicted with a combination of comedy and something that felt genuinely close to accuracy. Psilocybin experiences are not linear. They are not predictable in the way that the experience of a given quantity of alcohol is predictable. They involve periods of extreme clarity alternating with periods of extreme confusion. They can produce states of euphoric connection and states of terrifying dissolution. They have a habit of removing the ordinary psychological protections a person maintains around the things about themselves they prefer not to examine directly, and making those things present and immediate and impossible to look away from. This is why they are being studied as treatment for depression and post-traumatic stress. It is also why they are extremely unpleasant if you encounter them at the wrong time and in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong things waiting behind the barriers they dissolve. Brian encountered some of those things. The episode was not specific about the content of what he saw, because the show was working within the constraints of a network-animated comedy and did not have the tools to represent a genuinely profound psychedelic experience with the fidelity the experience deserved. But it depicted the aftermath, which was the part the episode could actually show. Brian emerged from the night's arc altered in ways that were not entirely comedic. He had been somewhere. He had looked at things he did not ordinarily look at. The Stewie who had sat with him through the night was looking at him across the morning in a way that acknowledged this without requiring it to be named. The scene that most people who remember this episode remember is the moment when Brian, deep in the experience and unable to locate the ordinary boundary between himself and the world, moved close to the wall and appeared to lose his ear. The show played this for comedy, which was the right choice within its register. But the loss of the ear, even as a drug-induced hallucination resolved without lasting damage, was the episode's way of naming the cost that inhabits any experience of genuine ego dissolution. You can come back from it. You usually come back from it, but you do not come back unchanged. Something small is always left at the wall. What the episode was actually doing, underneath the hurricane and the mushrooms and the babysitting comedy, was making a distinction the show had not previously made very clearly. There are different ways of using substances, and they are not all the same thing morally or experientially or in terms of consequence. Peter's relationship to beer was chronic and embedded and organized into the architecture of his daily life, in a way that produced measurable, ongoing harm to himself and to the people around him. Brian's Molly cocaine spiral in Season 3 had been a story of dependency and escalation, and the progressive destruction of the qualities that made him valuable as a friend and as a professional. But Brian's mushroom experience was something different. It was a one-time choice to step outside the ordinary parameters of conscious experience, to spend a night under the influence of something that most serious researchers describe as producing not dependency but insight, sometimes terrifying insight, sometimes beautiful insight, always something that needed to be metabolized before it could be understood. The show did not make this argument explicitly. It was a comedy episode and it produced good comedy. But the choice to depict Brian's experience with something other than the complete condemnation the show reserved for the cocaine arc, to have Stewie function as a calm and caring companion through the night, rather than as a horrified witness to deterioration, to end the episode with Brian simply having been somewhere and returned from it, suggested a sensibility that was more nuanced than most network television in 2011 was willing to apply to any controlled substance use. Psilocybin would go on, in the decade after this episode aired, to be approved for therapeutic use in several jurisdictions. The FDA designated it a breakthrough therapy. Clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and NYU and other major research institutions produced outcomes for treatment-resistant depression that the existing pharmacological tools had been unable to match. What the show depicted in A Hurricane in Quahog in October 2011 was, it turned out, on the less medically alarming end of the spectrum of things it had shown its characters doing to themselves. Brian's night with the mushrooms was weird and uncomfortable and funny. It was not, in any meaningful medical or scientific sense, the most dangerous night in the show's long roster of substance-related events. The half-dozen seasons of Peter drinking himself toward liver failure were considerably more alarming and considerably less examined. Section 7. Pilling them softly. Stewie's Adderall, Brian's theft, and the normalizing of prescription stimulants. Season 14 of Family Guy premiered in late September of 2015, and its first episode, Pilling Them Softly, was the show's attempt to address a topic that had, by that point, become one of the more prominent and contested conversations in American public life. The episode centered on Stewie Griffin receiving a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, being prescribed Adderall, and having his prescription stolen by Brian, who used the stimulant medication to power a creative project that produced, eventually, nothing of lasting value in a very uncomfortable meeting with George R.R. Martin. It was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Greg Colton. It aired on September 27th of 2015. The episode arrived in a cultural moment when the diagnosis and medication of ADHD, particularly in children, was being discussed in terms that ranged from genuine concern about underdiagnosis and inadequate support to equally genuine concern about overdiagnosis and the liberal prescription of powerful stimulants to children who might have been better served by environmental and behavioral interventions. The controversy was real, and the episode acknowledged it, after a fashion, by making the diagnosis itself part of the setup rather than treating it as unambiguously correct or unambiguously incorrect. Stewie was brought to a pediatric psychiatrist because his behavior had been attracting attention in ways that the adults in his life found disruptive. This was a fairly straightforward piece of situational comedy. Stewie Griffin, the former evil genius with a time machine and an extensive weapons collection, was being evaluated for a behavioral disorder. The gap between the system and the person it was processing was the joke. But it was also a real observation about how diagnostic frameworks work, which is to say, they work by matching a set of observed behaviors to a categorized pattern without necessarily having access to the underlying experiential reality producing those behaviors. Stewie's underlying experiential reality was not something the pediatric psychiatrist's framework was equipped to process. He received the diagnosis. He received the prescription. Adderall is an amphetamine. This is not a contested or nuanced fact. It is a Schedule II controlled substance in the United States, in the same federal category as cocaine and methamphetamine, distinguished from those substances primarily by the legal framework around its manufacture and prescription rather than by any categorical difference in its mechanism of action on the central nervous system. It is also a medication that helps a significant number of people with ADHD function at levels that their neurology would otherwise prevent. Both of these things are simultaneously true. The show was interested in the first of these truths and not especially interested in the second. Brian discovered the Adderall in Stewie's belongings. Brian's internal monologue, which the show rendered in the specific voice of self-justification that anyone who has ever rationalized a bad choice will recognize immediately, moved quickly from noticing the medication to constructing a framework in which using it was acceptable. He was not stealing from a baby. He was borrowing medication that the baby's doctor had probably prescribed too liberally. He was using it for a creative purpose. He was going to write something important, and the Adderall would make it possible. The project justified the means. The means was a controlled substance that did not belong to him. This is the structure of a great many decisions that produce harm. The reframing. The way the mind, confronted with the knowledge that a choice is wrong, reorganizes the available information until the choice appears to be not only acceptable but actually the right thing in the circumstances. Brian was not a thief. He was a writer taking necessary tools. Stewie was not a person whose prescription was being stolen. He was a misdiagnosed child who did not need the medication anyway. The Adderall was not a powerful stimulant being diverted from its prescribed use. It was fuel for a creative project that needed to exist. The whole architecture of the situation was rebuilt around the justification until the justification looked like the situation. The Adderall worked, in the short term, exactly as Adderall works for many people in the short term, when it is used outside the context of a real ADHD diagnosis. Brian experienced the specific and seductive qualities that make prescription stimulant diversion a significant public health problem in populations, including college students and creative professionals. Sustained focus, reduced need for sleep, reduced appetite producing an absence of the satiated lethargy that normally follows meals, a sense that every thought was both important and efficiently accessible, that the gap between having an idea and executing the idea had narrowed to the point of being almost imperceptible. He produced material at a pace he had never approached when operating on his ordinary neurological baseline. He pitched the resulting project to George R.R. Martin. This meeting was the episode's comedic peak, and it was very funny. Martin, depicted with the particular combination of affectionate roasting and genuine respect that the show reserved for cultural figures it actually liked, evaluated Brian's work with the specific critical honesty of someone who produces things at a very high level and recognizes work that does not reach that level when he encounters it. He was not cruel about it. He was matter-of-fact. The work was not good. The energy that had gone into producing it had not produced quality. It had produced volume. This is a thing that stimulants are quite good at doing, generating the sensation of productivity and output without necessarily generating the quality judgment that makes output worth anything. Brian had made a lot of something. Martin declined to engage with it further. The Adderall ran out or was returned to Stewie. The episode's conclusion on this thread was somewhat brisk. Brian returned to his ordinary functioning, which felt slower and duller and less capable than the stimulant-assisted version of himself had felt, because this is what happens after stimulant use. The baseline feels diminished against the memory of enhancement. This is part of the mechanism by which stimulant dependency develops in people who use these medications recreationally. The ordinary state of mind feels inadequate. The gap between the enhanced version and the baseline version is experienced as a loss. The solution that presents itself is more of the thing that created the enhancement. Brian, in the episode's logic, simply returned to being Brian. But the episode had made a small and honest observation about the relationship between performance and enhancement that was more thoughtful than it needed to be. The show was doing something interesting by centering this story on Adderall specifically at this particular cultural moment. The medication had become, by 2015, one of the most widely misused prescription substances in American life, with diversion rates in college-age populations that alarmed public health researchers, and with a cultural discourse around its use that was significantly less concerned than the discourse around illegal drug use, largely because it was prescribed by doctors and was available in a pharmacy. The legal availability functioned as a kind of moral laundering. If a doctor could give it to you, it could not be the same category of thing as cocaine. The show was quietly, and without any didactic ambition, pointing at the flaw in this reasoning. The same substance that one person legitimately needed and another person used as a performance enhancer was the same substance, and the mechanism it used to help the person with ADHD function and to make the person without ADHD feel more capable was the same mechanism. And the difference in moral status assigned to the two uses was more about legal categories than about pharmacology. This was not a point the show belabored. It was a comedy episode, and good comedy does not belabor. But it was there, and it was true, and it was more than a great deal of television in 2015 was willing to say on the subject. Section 8. Brian and Stewie, the vault, the gun, and the scotch. That confessed everything. Of everything this show produced across its very long run, one episode is referenced more consistently and more reverently in fan discussions about what the show was capable of at its absolute best. Not in its early seasons, not in the golden years that everyone knows by name, but in Season 8, which aired from 2009 to 2010, the show produced 22 minutes of television that felt, to many viewers, genuinely unlike anything else the show had attempted. The episode was called Brian and Stewie. It was the show's 150th episode. It aired on May 2nd, 2010. It was written by Mark Henteman and directed by Joseph Lee, and it had no cutaway gags. It had no secondary storyline. It had no other characters. It was two characters locked in a bank vault on a Saturday afternoon, talking. That was the entire episode. Two characters, one room, one evening, real time. In the context of a show that had by Season 8 developed a significant dependency on cutaway gags as its primary comedy delivery mechanism, a show that frequently used the scatter of disconnected jokes as a way of avoiding the sustained commitment that real character work required, this choice was startling. It was the show stripping itself down to nothing but the characters, with nowhere to hide and no way to avoid the question of whether those characters were still worth the attention being paid to them. It was a bet that Brian and Stewie had accumulated enough genuine emotional weight across 8 seasons to sustain an episode that gave them nothing to do but talk to each other in a confined space. The bet paid off. The vault scenario was simple. Brian had been using the bank's safe deposit box to store a personal item. On a Saturday after banking hours, he and Stewie were locked inside by accident when the timed security system engaged before they could leave. They had food because Stewie had brought a bag. They had water. They had a few modest comforts. They had the long hours of the evening and night to fill with, nobody else to fill them with, and nowhere else for the conversation to go. What they found in that time was the episode's subject. The early portion of the vault sequence was played primarily for comedy, and it was good comedy. Stewie produced food from the bag. He established a system for managing the confined space with the particular competence and organizational precision that even in his softer post-season 4 form remained one of his most consistent traits. Brian paced. Brian was uncomfortable with the confinement in a way that was initially read as comedy and was later revealed to be something else. The two of them negotiated the space the way that two people who have known each other for a long time negotiate an uncomfortable situation. With the shorthand and the specific tolerances and the specific irritations that long familiarity produces, and underneath all of that, with the genuine care that the familiarity had also produced. Brian asked Stewie to retrieve something from the safe deposit box. He gave him a combination. Stewie opened the box and found 2 things: a bottle of fine scotch and a gun. The scotch was Brian's. This was immediately, obviously consistent with everything the show had built about Brian's relationship to alcohol. A man who keeps a reserve of expensive whiskey in a secure deposit box against whatever occasion might require it is a man for whom the bottle is always, at some level, a solution waiting for the correct problem to present itself. The scotch was a contingency, an emergency resource. The presence of it in the vault, in the secure box rather than the liquor cabinet at home, suggested that it was a specific kind of emergency resource, the kind you set aside in a place where it cannot be casually consumed, the kind that needs to be preserved for the right moment. That the right moment might be being locked in a bank vault on a Saturday night with your best friend was perhaps more true than Brian had intended to reveal when he asked Stewie to open the box. The gun was Brian's too. This was not consistent with anything the show had previously established about Brian. Nothing in 8 seasons of the character had suggested that he owned a firearm or had any interest in owning one. The gun was not a defensive tool. It was not a pet project or a prop or a misunderstanding. Stewie asked Brian about the gun, and Brian, in the specific and quiet voice of someone who has been keeping a very heavy thing for a very long time, and is suddenly, in the context of a confined vault with nowhere to deflect and no third character to redirect the conversation toward, ready to put it down, told Stewie that he kept the gun in case he decided he did not want to do this anymore. He was talking about his life. He was talking about ending it. The episode went still. Not in a dramatic way, in the way that a room goes still when something true has finally been said, something that had been present in the atmosphere for a long time before anyone named it. Stewie sat with what he had just been told. He did not panic. He did not deliver a speech. He responded the way a person who genuinely loves another person responds to the discovery that the other person is suffering in ways that have not been visible. With the specific quality of attention that says this matters and I'm not going anywhere and we are going to stay here with this until you have said what you need to say. Brian explained himself. He talked about the accumulation of failures that had organized his relationship to his own future. The novel, always unfinished. The writing career, always on the verge of beginning. The love life, always just missing the thing it was reaching for. The sense of being perpetually, almost but never actually the person he was supposed to be. The person he had told himself he was. The person the scotch and the books and the martini glass and the particular manner of holding himself in a room had always been performing in advance of any actual evidence. He was tired, not dramatically or immediately or in a way that had produced any specific crisis, but tired in the chronic, erosive, incrementally accumulating way of someone who has been pretending for a long time and cannot quite locate the energy to continue the pretense. The scotch and the gun in the same box was not an accident of the episode's composition. They were a pair. The scotch for the nights when the performance was possible, when the combination of the drink and the persona and the companionship of the Griffins and the specific familiar texture of being Brian Griffin was enough to make the day manageable. And the gun for the night when it was not enough. For the night when the scotch had become more of the problem than of the solution, and the pretense had become insupportable. The gun was the contingency that made the other contingency possible to maintain. It was the escape hatch that made the building tolerable, because knowing there is a door, even if you never intend to use it, makes the room less suffocating. Stewie's response was the episode's most quietly remarkable piece of writing. He told Brian that he needed him. Not in the way a character delivers that line in the conventional script of these conversations, with the full emotional orchestration and the swelling score and the explicit declaration of love as a corrective to suicidal ideation. Stewie said it the way a person says it when they mean it specifically and factually and without any of the performance that the sentiment can acquire when it is deployed as medicine. He needed Brian. Brian's presence in his life was not interchangeable with any other presence. The particular way Brian existed in the world, the specific quality of his intelligence and his humor and his reliability, even when the reliability was the reliability of someone who was failing in ways that everyone could see was irreplaceable. Stewie could not do without it. That was true and specific and offered without manipulation or theater. Brian drank the scotch. The gun stayed in the box. The vault opened in the morning. The episode never resolved the question of whether Brian's suicidal ideation was over, healed by the honesty of the night and the quality of Stewie's response. It did not pretend that one conversation in a vault, however true and however needed, was sufficient to permanently alter the relationship between a person and the decision they had been holding in reserve. It ended instead with a morning, with the door open and the two of them stepping back into the ordinary world with the night between them. And with the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have been genuinely honest with each other and are not sure yet what the honesty means for what comes next. It was an extraordinary piece of television, and it was about alcohol in the most honest and the most complete way the show ever managed. Not as a primary subject, but as the thing in the box beside the gun, the companion and the enabler, and the partial solution that made all the other partial solutions necessary. Section 9. Prescription heroin, Lois, painkillers, and the medicine cabinet. As character study. Season 20 of Family Guy aired across 2021 and 2022, and whatever reservations one might hold about the show in its later seasons, whatever the ratings numbers suggested about the erosion of the audience that had once loved it, the season contained an episode that deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the show's engagement with addiction as a subject. Prescription Heroin, which aired on March 27, 2022, was the show returning to a specific and pressing dimension of the American opioid crisis through the lens of its most reliable vehicle for domestic stories, Lois Griffin. The episode's premise moved efficiently. Brian had visited a veterinarian for some minor condition and had been prescribed a course of pain medication. The medication, a synthetic opioid, was legal, prescribed, and sitting in the Griffin household's medicine cabinet in a labeled container. Lois encountered it during the ordinary course of maintaining the household. Lois, who by season 20 had sustained enough episodic physical and emotional stress to constitute a reasonable argument for why someone might need pharmaceutical assistance to manage their days, took some. It helped. She took more. What the episode was engaging with, whether or not the writers had consciously mapped it onto the national story, was the specific and particularly American pathway into opioid dependency that had, over the previous 2 decades, produced a crisis of a scale that the public health establishment had not seen in its recorded history. The pathway did not begin with heroin purchased from a street dealer. It began with a prescription in a medicine cabinet. It began with a legitimately produced, legitimately dispensed, genuinely effective pharmaceutical product that was, as it turned out, among the most addictive substances ever formulated. It began with pain that was real and with medicine that addressed the pain so effectively that the absence of the medicine became, in time, its own kind of pain. Not just the return of the original pain, but a new pain. A pain produced by the nervous system's adaptation to the presence of the substance. A pain that the substance itself had created by teaching the body to need it. Lois's experience in the episode followed this logic with a fidelity that was, for season 20, of a show that had been through everything the show had been through, surprising. She was not depicted as weak or as morally deficient. She was depicted as a person who had been in pain and had found something that helped the pain and had continued taking it past the point where her body could be argued to have needed it because the pain of stopping had become worse than any benefit of stopping could counterbalance. This is the pharmacological reality of opioid dependency, and the episode depicted it without the condescension or the moral simplification that addiction narratives often reach for when a sympathetic character is involved. Brian discovered that Lois had been using his medication. His response involved a choice that the episode played primarily for comedy, but that had a genuine structural logic underneath it. He locked her in a crate. His dog crate, the one the family occasionally used when Brian needed to be contained for one reason or another, which was now being used to contain Lois while she went through the withdrawal process. The image of Lois Griffin in a dog crate was extremely funny, and the show knew it was extremely funny, and it did not ask you to look away from the comedy in favor of the seriousness. But it was also depicting something real. Withdrawal from opioids, particularly in the absence of medical assistance, is genuinely miserable in ways that the episode communicated through Lois's physical discomfort and her specific complaints about what her body was doing, without graphic detail and without the melodrama that could have turned the situation into a different kind of television. Brian's role in this episode as the reluctant caretaker of someone withdrawing from a substance was the show engaging, late in its run, with a dynamic that had become increasingly familiar in American households across the country during the years the opioid crisis had been developing. The person who had to manage someone else's withdrawal, the person who had to make the decision about whether to seek formal medical help which would involve other people and other consequences, or to manage it at home, quietly, within the boundaries of the existing relationship. The person who had to hold the space while the body of someone they cared about went through something terrible that could not be accelerated or interrupted, only endured. Lois came through it. She emerged from the crate uncomfortable and damaged, but not destroyed. The episode allowed her a moment of honest reckoning with what had happened that did not reach for the convenient narrative arc of complete and lasting transformation. She had been dependent. She had withdrawn. She was now provisionally and tentatively and without guarantees on the other side of the acute phase of the dependency. Whether she would stay on the other side was not a question the episode was going to answer definitively, because definitively answering it would require the show to commit to a version of Lois that subsequent episodes would immediately undo. The show had learned, or perhaps always known, that it could not honor the permanent consequences of its most serious storylines within its own ongoing production logic. So it gave you the acute moment with genuine honesty and then released you into the ambiguity of continuation. What made the episode more interesting than its premise might have suggested was the choice to route the story through Brian's prescription. Lois did not buy these pills from anyone. She did not seek them out. They were in her house because a member of her household had a legitimate prescription. The episode was making a quiet observation about the specific geography of the opioid crisis's domestic phase, the way that the entry point for millions of people was not a transaction, but simply a proximity. Medicine cabinet, family member's prescription. The substance was already there, already named and legitimized by the medical system, already present in the ordinary household context. The decision to use it was not even always recognized as a decision in the moment. It was so close to ordinary medicine taking, so structurally similar to taking ibuprofen for a headache or antihistamine for allergies, that the line between use and misuse was not visible at the beginning of the crossing. This observation was worth making in 2022, when the opioid crisis had killed well over 500,000 Americans since the late 1990s, according to figures from the Centers for Disease Control. And when the conversation about how those deaths had happened was still in many quarters organized around a narrative of personal moral failure, rather than pharmaceutical design and distribution decisions made by specific companies and specific people at specific moments in time. Lois in the dog crate was funny. But the thing that put Lois in the dog crate was not primarily about Lois. It was about the bottle in the medicine cabinet. It was about the substrate from which the dependency had grown, and about how close to home that substrate had always been. Section 10, 25 years of substance, what the show's full arc actually says. This final section requires stepping back from the individual episodes and looking at the complete picture. 25 years, more than 400 episodes. A character roster that began as sharp and carefully observed and became, over time, something different. What does Family Guy's long relationship with addiction as a narrative subject actually add up to? What did the show believe, or reveal it believed, about the substances its characters used and the ways those substances shaped the lives they were living? The first and most honest observation is that the show normalized alcohol to a degree that exceeded, by a wide margin, its engagement with any other substance. The cocaine arc was treated as a crisis. The shoplifting was an aberration that required narrative resolution. The mushrooms were strange and temporary and bounded by a specific night. The Adderall theft was framed as transgression. The painkillers produced an episode organized around recovery, but the beer, the wine, the scotch, the martini, the endless evenings at the Drunken Clam, across every season and through every period of the show's creative evolution, were simply the texture of daily life. They were never the subject. They were the ground. This is not a purely critical observation. It is an accurate one. Alcohol occupies this position in the show because alcohol occupies this position in the culture the show was depicting. The working-class American domestic comedy has always organized itself substantially around beer and the bar, because the working-class American experience has historically organized itself substantially around beer and the bar. The Drunken Clam was not invented for Family Guy. It was observed. It was present in the real landscape of working-class American social life. and the show reproduced it with the fidelity that made the early seasons feel true in a way that the later seasons increasingly did not. But the normalization had consequences that the show rarely examined. When Peter's alcohol consumption was the invisible substrate of every episode, the question of whether Peter's alcohol consumption was actually fine was never really asked. The question was always about Peter's specific behaviors and their specific consequences: the bar fight, the bad decision, the hurt feeling, the crash car. The thing producing the behaviors was not examined because examining it would require stepping outside the premise of the show, would require asking whether the very architecture of Peter's daily life was part of what was wrong with Peter's daily life. And that question was not one the show was able to ask while remaining the show it was. Friends of Peter G came the closest to asking it. The image of death showing Peter the two futures was the show's most direct engagement with the question of what the drinking was actually costing, and the choice the episode made, the half a beer poured down the drain, the moderation rather than the sobriety, was a thoughtful and honest choice about where the show could responsibly land, given everything it had built. But then the show failed to honor that choice in its subsequent episodes, and the question was buried again under the next 20 episodes of Peter at the bar, as if the conversation with death had never happened. Brian's story is the most complete arc the show produced on this subject, which is a strange thing to say about a character whose trajectory was, by most assessments, a creative failure. The early Brian, intelligent and grounded and capable of real friendship and genuine loyalty, had flaws that were balanced by genuine strengths. His drinking was one of his flaws. It was depicted as a flaw in the specific early seasons way. Noted, integrated into his character, productive of some comedic situations and some more serious ones, but not determinative. He was more than his drinking. He was the sum of many things. The later Brian had been stripped of most of those things. What remained, in many episodes of the middle and later seasons, was the drinking, the pretension, the failed writing career, and the cycle of bad decisions organized primarily around the pursuit of women and the avoidance of real accountability. And the connection between the drinking and the bad decisions was never properly made. The show presented a character who was deteriorating and whose deterioration had alcohol as a constant background presence and never asked whether the constant background presence was doing some of the deteriorating. It was as if the show had accidentally produced a character study in the natural history of untreated alcoholism, without intending to and without being willing to acknowledge what it had made. The Quagmire speech in Season 8, in the episode Jerome is the New Black, was the show's most direct and most honest indictment of Brian. It called him a phony, a failed writer, a bad father, a manipulative presence in the household, someone whose high opinion of himself was supported by nothing in his actual behavior. Quagmire listed specific things Brian had done and named them clearly and without softening. The audience was apparently intended to side with Quagmire, and the audience did, because every specific thing Quagmire listed was accurate, and the speech landed not as an unfair attack, but as a long overdue accounting. But Quagmire did not mention the drinking, not in any direct or sustained way. The speech was about pretension and failure and hypocrisy and bad behavior. The thing that had been the medium of most of the bad behavior, the thing that had been Brian's most consistent and most visible relationship across every season, the thing in the safety deposit box beside the gun, was not the subject of the speech. The show could see what had happened to Brian. It could not quite see or could not quite say what had been happening to Brian. The Stewie and Brian Vault episode was the show's correction of this, and it was produced in the same season as the Quagmire speech, which makes the two episodes a remarkable pair. One episode told you what Brian had become from the outside. The other told you what Brian had been living from the inside. And the inside version was organized around a bottle of scotch in a safety deposit box, and a gun in the same box, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been performing a version of themselves for a very long time without being sure the performance was worth continuing. The alcohol was not the cause of all of this, but it was the companion of all of it. It was the thing there at every stage, at every low point, at every evening, when the gap between who Brian presented himself as and who Brian actually was became too large to navigate without chemical assistance. Lois's stories across the show's run were about the specific pressure of the role she occupied. The shoplifting was about a person whose identity was entirely organized around competent management needing to find a transgressive exit. The painkillers were about a person in genuine pain finding a pharmaceutical solution and discovering that the solution had a dependency built into it. Both of these were honest observations about women in domestic arrangements that require constant output and provide inadequate acknowledgement. Both were also treated by the show as episodic disruptions rather than as structural critiques, as problems that could be resolved and returned to the default rather than as symptoms of something that the default was producing and would continue producing. Meg's relationship to the show's substance abuse themes is the most indirect but perhaps the most revealing. Meg used nothing. She had no arc of dependency, no episode organized around her chemical relationship to anything. She was simply the person around whom every other character's worst behaviors were organized. The drinking and the cruelty and the bad decisions and the accumulated failures of everyone in the house landed on Meg. She absorbed them. And then, in Seahorse Seashell Party, she named what she had been absorbing, and the show gave her the satisfaction of that naming for approximately 4 minutes before returning her to her position beneath the pile. The substances and the abuse of Meg were, in the show's architecture, performing the same function. They were the release valves through which the pressure of the household was discharged. When the drinking provided insufficient release, the cruelty toward Meg took up the slack. When the cruelty toward Meg was briefly interrupted by her rebellion, the household turned its accumulated pressure on itself and fell apart. The equilibrium required a sacrificial figure. In the Griffin house, that figure was Meg, and the substances were the instruments through which the other members of the household maintained the energy to keep assigning her that role. This is a dark reading of a cartoon comedy, but it is not an inaccurate one. The show was not conscious of all of this. It was not writing a sustained argument about the structural dynamics of domestic addiction and scapegoating. It was writing jokes, season by season, with a rotating cast of writers who were each responding to the existing material and making their own additions to it. But the accumulation of choices across 25 years produced a picture, and the picture was darker than the show intended and more specific than most network animation would have been capable of producing, and it is worth looking at the picture directly rather than only at the individual frames. Family Guy is not a great show about addiction. It is a show that spent 25 years accidentally producing an increasingly accurate portrait of what addiction looks like in a household where it is never named as addiction, where it is simply the texture of things, where the bar and the bottle are so present and so normalized that the question of their effect never quite surfaces in any sustained or definitive way. The show could not fix what it depicted because the depiction was the show. Removing the alcohol would have required removing the drunken clam, which would have required removing the specific social architecture of Peter's world, which would have required making Family Guy something other than Family Guy. The drinking was not a subject, it was a premise. And in the gaps between the cutaway gags, between the shock value and the flanderization and the declining ratings and the gradual erosion of everything that had made the early seasons feel genuinely alive, that premise continued to quietly narrate something true about a specific kind of household, a specific kind of city, a specific kind of life. The humor wore thin over time. The characters became shells of themselves. The show continued past the point where its continuation was artistically justified. But underneath all of that, the Drunken Clam stood. And at the bar, Peter Griffin drank his beer and called his friends over, and laughed at something they were all pretending was funny, in the specific way that people who have organized their social lives around a substance laugh. Because the alternative, the silence in which the full texture of things might become audible, was something none of them were prepared for. That is not a joke. It is not a cutaway. It is the show's longest and quietest and most honest running observation. And it was there from the first episode to the last one, currently airing, unchanging and unresolved and completely real, running underneath everything else the show was doing, and feeling like the only part of it that was never trying to be anything other than what it was. If you have made it this far through this particular late night with me, I want to say something directly before we close. These stories matter because they reflect real things. The Drunken Clam is a real place in the sense that the Drunken Clam exists in every city and town and neighborhood under different names. Peter Griffin's drinking is a real thing in the sense that Peter Griffin's specific relationship to beer is a real relationship that real people have with real substances every day. Brian's safety deposit box is a real thing in the sense that the particular architecture of having an escape hatch, of keeping the hardest option available as a way of making all the other options bearable, is a real architecture that real people build inside themselves and live inside without telling anyone. These things are all around us. The comedy made them visible. The visibility is worth something. If you found something useful in this or something that named a thing you had not had the words for, please share it. If it helped you think about something you have been trying not to think about, that is worth something too. The comment section is open and I read all of it. Please like this video if it was worth the time. Please subscribe if you want more of this kind of slow, careful, detailed storytelling about the things that animated television has been quietly saying to us for decades. We are building something here, one video at a time, and your presence is what makes it worth building. I will see you in the next one. A final note, the show that kept going and what it left behind. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all this about what it means for a show to continue past the point where its creator's passion for it is primarily creative. Family Guy was renewed in April of 2025 for 4 additional seasons, a deal that would extend the show through its 30th anniversary in the 2028 to 2029 television season. 30 years, each new season to consist of 15 episodes. The mathematics of this are worth doing simply as an exercise in understanding what kind of institution the show has become. By the time those seasons conclude, Family Guy will have produced somewhere in the range of 450 to 500 episodes. That is not a television show in any ordinary sense of the word. That is something closer to a continuous and ongoing archive of a specific kind of American domestic life, produced over a period of time long enough to track genuine cultural shifts in how that life is understood, organized, and medicated. The substances in the show changed in ways that reflected the country's relationship to substances across the same period. The early seasons were organized primarily around alcohol, which was the most culturally legible and most socially accepted chemical relationship in American life during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The cocaine arc in Season 3 acknowledged the presence of harder drugs as a real dimension of certain kinds of social experience, particularly among people who were trying to perform a version of themselves that their ordinary neurological resources could not sustain indefinitely. The prescription medication stories, which arrived later in the show's run, arrived alongside the cultural awakening to what had been happening in American medicine and American pharmaceutical distribution during those same years. The show was, in this sense, accidentally topical, not because it was tracking current events with any particular intention, but because the writers were living in the same country as the audience, and the same country had the same problems. And those problems found their way into the scripts through the ordinary channel of human beings writing about the world they knew. The opioid crisis that prescription heroin engaged with in Season 20 was not a crisis that had been invented for that episode's purposes. By the time that episode aired in 2022, the Centers for Disease Control estimated that opioids had been involved in more than 500,000 deaths in the United States since 1999. That number is so large that it resists comprehension at first encounter. 500,000 deaths, more than the entire population of several American states, concentrated in a crisis that was substantially manufactured by specific corporate decisions made by specific people who understood what the molecules they were selling would do to the bodies of the people they sold them to. Lois Griffin in a Dog Crate was a 22-minute comedy episode. The thing it was pointing at was among the most consequential public health disasters in American recorded history. The show was not equipped to address that disaster with the seriousness it deserved. No network animated comedy is, but the fact that the disaster found its way into the show at all, that the writers chose to organize an episode around Lois and opioids at that particular moment, was itself an observation about how pervasive the crisis had become. When something enters a show like Family Guy, it has usually reached the point of genuine cultural saturation. Family Guy was not covering the opioid crisis in the way a news program or a prestige drama would cover it. It was doing what it always did, which was taking the recognizable texture of American domestic life and finding the comedy in it. The fact that the recognizable texture of American domestic life in 2022 included medicine cabinet opioids that the whole family could accidentally access was the observation. The dog crate was the joke. Both things were simultaneously true. Brian's relationship to alcohol is worth one more sustained look before we conclude, because it is the show's longest continuous thread on this subject, and because it changed in ways that reflected something genuine about the cultural moment the show was inhabiting. The Brian of Season 1 was a drinker in the way that Hemingway characters are drinkers, with the literary and masculine associations of a particular kind of intelligent man who uses alcohol as a social lubricant and a creative medium and a marker of the kind of sophistication that distinguishes him from the people around him who do not read or travel or have opinions about art. This was always somewhat comic, but it was comic in a way that was also genuinely fond. The martini was an affectation, yes, but it was a lovable affectation. The affectation of someone who wanted the world to be more interesting than it was, and had decided to dress for the world he wanted rather than the world he had. The Brian of Season 12, Season 15, Season 20 was a drinker in a much less romantic sense. The literary associations had dissolved because the literary aspirations had been repeatedly exposed as exactly that. Aspirations unmatched by output or genuine intellectual discipline. The sophistication had been revealed as performance by Quagmire, and by the Vault Knight, and by the accumulated small indignities of an existence that had produced very little of the things it had most confidently predicted it would produce. What was left was someone who drank, fairly consistently, in ways that made the days manageable, at a cost that was distributed across all the relationships and all the interactions and all the decisions that accumulated into the texture of an unremarkable and somewhat unhappy life. This is what long-term alcohol dependency actually looks like when it looks like its least dramatic version. Not the acute crisis, not the rock-bottom moment, the chronic management, the way that a certain level of regular consumption becomes the baseline from which everything else is measured, the way that the absence of the substance becomes its own kind of weather, a dull and persistent discomfort that the substance relieves, and that the relief of requires slightly more of the substance over time, slightly more regularly, to maintain the same quality of relief. Brian was not a dramatic alcoholic in the later seasons. He was a functional one, and functional alcoholics are harder to see and harder to help and harder to tell the story of because the story does not have the shape of a crisis. It has the shape of an ordinary life that is slowly and quietly, and in ways that are visible mainly in retrospect, diminishing. The show did not intend this reading. It was writing a character, making comedy, keeping a long-running production on schedule. But the character accumulated, season by season, across more than 2 decades, and the accumulation told a story that the individual episodes were not trying to tell. That is sometimes how the most honest stories get told. Not through intention, but through accumulation. Not through design, but through duration. The show ran long enough that the repetition of the same dynamics, year after year, produced a portrait that no single episode had set out to paint. Family Guy was not trying to be honest about alcoholism, but it was honest about it anyway, in the way that the texture of a life is honest about itself, whether or not the person living it has chosen to examine what the texture reveals. Stewie, in all of his versions, was the character who never needed the substances. He was always in his original form, the one who generated his own altered states through the specific and extraordinary quality of his internal life. The evil genius baby who built weapons in his crib was not escaping anything. He was present, dangerously, completely, without any need for chemical assistance. His focus was total. His motivation was absolute. His relationship to the world around him was one of unmediated engagement with a clarity and a purpose that none of the other characters could maintain for more than a scene at a time. This is part of why the loss of original Stewie mattered as much as it did. The show retired the only character who did not need the substances to get through the day, and replaced him with a character who had many of the same soft vulnerabilities as the people around him. Vulnerabilities that the substances were so good at temporarily addressing. What the show lost when it lost original Stewie was the counterexample. The proof that a life of genuine engagement and genuine purpose and genuine presence, however bizarre and however violent its objectives, was possible to live without reaching for the bottle. Peter needed the bar. Brian needed the martini. Even Lois needed the shoplifting and then the painkillers to interrupt the relentlessness of the management project. But Stewie, in seasons 1 through 3, needed nothing external to be fully, completely, alarmingly himself. And the show, in its long drift toward comfort and normalization and the flattening of its most interesting character into its most relatable one, took that away. It left a family and a town and a bar and a set of habits so normalized that the question of whether those habits were harming anyone never quite surfaced long enough to be seriously examined. That is the show's legacy on this particular subject, read across the full span of its run. Not a message about addiction, not a moral about substances, simply a very detailed, very long, very funny, and very true portrait of how a specific kind of household in a specific kind of American town organized itself around the things that made the days feel manageable, and how that organization was so deep and so constant that it became invisible, and how something that is invisible cannot be changed, and how the unchanging of it, season after season, year after year, was both the show's central joke and its quietest and most persistent truth.